Alfred Nobel was a Swedish physicist, and his great accomplishment was that he invented dynamite. You already can start thinking and realizing what a innovation that was to invent dynamite. His intentions to invent dynamite were not necessarily what actually occurred. He intended to create a powerful explosive so that roads could be built, so that towns could be made better, so bridges could be built, to be able to overcome the geographic obstacles, the land obstacles that would enable railroads and roads and bridges and all these things to be built. And as you know, that invention was misused. It would eventually be used for war, for killing people, for destructive purposes. And Alfred was very bothered by this. After he had accumulated a lot of wealth from his invention of dynamite, he took $9 million of his own money and he started a fund, and he wanted to recognize people who would use their talents and abilities for the right reason. And he called it, or it's called today still, the Nobel Peace Prize. And so his invention, although very good intentions, was misused. He was bothered by this. And so you see in that little illustration that there is a little bit of a contradiction, isn't there? There is the good intentions of doing something good, but then it is used wrongly. But he was really concerned about how this was used, and he became focused on peace. There's something of that in our text today. I would like for you to take your Bibles, open them to the book of Mark, chapter 5. And there is this big theme and this big idea about peace in our text today. There is also in our text today, which has a lot to do with that illustration of these things of contradictions. You'll see it as we go through it, but there's contradictions with what Jesus is doing and how He is bringing peace. And then there are people who have misused God's creation and what God has given them. This is the story. It's often called the demoniac. It is a story about a man that is living in a graveyard in the tombs, and he is demon-possessed. And Jesus will come on the scene, and He is going to rescue this man. And there's a lot here in this text. We'll try to move as quickly as possible, but also I want you to grasp the main idea. The first thing I want you to see this morning is this hopeless outcast. There's a picture here of it's the epitome of lost humanity. It is the epitome of the effects of sin. It is just a gross explanation of what happens to a person when they are apart from Jesus. You'll notice there in the first 5 verses, there's a great description of this man. Mark chapter 5 and 1 through 5, great description of this man and his condition. And you'll see there in verse 1 that this is following, they're traveling. They had been going across the Sea of Galilee, and on that night before on the Sea of Galilee is when that great storm arises, and they're in the ship, and the disciples feel like that they're going to die. You remember that story. It's very, very common, very popular, very well-known story. And Jesus rebukes the wind and the sea and calms the sea. He brings calm to the sea. And then they ask the question at the very end, and I think it's in the last verse of chapter 4, what manner of man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Well, he comes now, and they come after that night, and it's probably early morning, and they approach the shore, and they're going to the southeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. On that southeast corner, they're going to be met by a man who comes running out of the tombs. His life, his residence, his dwelling is what it says in the text, is that he lives among the tombs. And by the way, we have these nice, I know that graveyards are not a place where we go and have a picnic. It's a place of sorrow. It's a place of mourning. It's a place of respect and all this. But that's not the way their graveyards looked back then. They didn't have headstones, and they didn't have mausoleums, and they didn't have all that stuff. What they did was they would bury their dead in caves. And when they get off this part of the world, when they would have hills and mountains, and they would have caves, and it would create a place to where they could bury their dead in these caves. This is where this man lived. He lived in caves, and he lived in the tombs. Well, notice there in verse 1, it says, "And they came over to the other side of the sea. They traveled from the northwestern side," which is where Capernaum and Tiberias is, and where Jesus had spent most of his ministry, "and they come now to the east side." On the east side of the Sea of Galilee is Gentile territory. We're not in Jewish territory. We're in Gentile territory. These people do not observe the law. They're not looking for the Messiah. They are just living life. And so Jesus goes over there, and it appears from the text that he has a purpose in mind, and we don't know until he gets there what's going to happen. But it says there in verse 2 of chapter 5, it says, "And when he was come out of the ship," when Jesus gets off of the ship early in the morning, after a rough night of a storm and all this, and this miracle of calming the sea, he gets out of the ship, and he comes, and it says immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. So we see that why does this man live among the tombs? Why does he make his residence in a graveyard? Why does he live this life? Because he is demon possessed. He has an unclean spirit. Now there's a key word in this text today, unclean. There's another one that I want you to write down. We're going to come back to later if you're taking notes, and that is beg. Notice here this first word, unclean. Unclean in the Old Testament, in Jewish thought, in the minds of the people that Jesus was primarily talking to, maybe not the Gentiles, but most Jewish people, when they heard the word unclean, what they would be talking about is ceremonially unclean. It would denote someone who was not fit to stand in the presence of God. Someone or something that was unclean would not be able to go and worship in the tabernacle. So it is someone. This is a great summary of what I'm trying to say. Is that it's someone or something that cannot properly relate to God. They are unclean, they are unholy, they are defiled. And so this man has a defiled and unclean spirit within him. And by the way, to the Jewish mind, the Gentiles were also unclean. Notice here also the tombs. In the law, they were not supposed to go to a graveyard, and if they did, they would have to go through a ritual. If they were to touch the dead, a corpse, a dead body, they would be rendered unclean. This man is just not unclean. He is living in an unclean place, and he has an unclean spirit within him. He is the epitome of someone who cannot properly relate to God. He's unfit to stand in the presence of God. And here comes Jesus off of the ship, and this man comes running up to him. Now watch what happens in this story. It says, who had his dwelling among the tombs. He lives among the tombs. But also, look at the last half of verse 3, and also all the way through verse 5, because this is just a sad situation. This is a sad predicament and just a way of life. Look at what it says here. It says, No man could bind him. He was out of control. He would be violent, and they sometimes would put chains on him, on his legs and on his arms, to try to control him. He was an out-of-control kind of person. He was someone who was wild. This was literally a wild man. And it was because he was under the power and control of this evil spirit. Now watch, it goes into great detail in verse 4 and 5. It says, because that he had often been bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, this man had superhuman strength. He was able to tear these chains away, and no one could control this person. He was an out-of-control person. I heard a funny story the other day, and it was about Muhammad Ali. He was on an airplane, and they were about to take off, and the flight attendant said, "Sir, you need to put your seatbelt on." Well, he ignored her, and she went about her business. She knew that he ignored her. And so she comes back to him a few minutes later and says, "Sir, I need you to put your seatbelt on." She goes and she leaves. He just ignores her. She comes back, and the plane is taxiing on the runway, and they're about to take off. And she comes back to him and says, "Sir, this plane is not going to take off until you put your seatbelt on." Muhammad Ali looked at the flight attendant and he said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." And she looked at him and she said, "Sir, I'm not going to say it again. Superman don't need a plane either." This man had superhuman strength. No one could tame him. No one could control him. He was a menace to society. He was dangerous. He was violent. Notice in verse 5, this is really sad though. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. I don't have to go into great detail, but as you know, this is just a pitiful picture of someone who is in an uproar, someone who is destructive not only to others, but is destructive to himself. He is miserable. He has insomnia. This is his life. He is an outcast. He is socially ostracized, and no one can be around him. No one can stand him. He is a threat to himself and others. Well, notice in 6 through 13 what happens here in this story. Jesus is here. Jesus is present. And I want to tell you, when Jesus is present in your life, there is hope. Now watch what happens in this text in verses 6 through 13. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshiped him. That doesn't necessarily mean that he worshiped him in the spirit in a good way, but what it means is he fell down before his feet. Now I want you to know this in verses 6 through 8, when you hear the dialogue between the man and Jesus, it's not necessarily the man talking to him, it's the demon within him talking to Jesus. And listen to what the demons say to Jesus. It says, but when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice, and said, what have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. Now, this is probably not the man. This is probably the demons that are speaking to Jesus. But the demons recognize that they are in the presence of the Jesus, the Son, the Most High of God. Now, watch what happens here in this. He says in verse 8, and so this is kind of a flashback. Mark takes us back in time. The reason that he cried out with a loud voice in verse 7 is because he had previously said, come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. Jesus is going to command, he has total control of this demon, and he is telling the demon to come out of the man, and the response is actually in verse 7, and he recognizes who Jesus is, and he doesn't want to do it. Well, you're not going to be able to resist the power of this man. This man, Jesus is who I'm talking about, has total control over this situation and over this demon. The demon's not going to dictate to Jesus. Jesus is going to dictate to the demon what's going to happen. Now watch this. He says in verse 9, and Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now you may not catch this or pick up on this, but this word legion is the term that is used to describe a Roman military unit of 6,000 troops. It doesn't mean that there's 6,000 demons, but what it means is we are many. We are a lot, and we are powerful, and that's what the demon says. Our name is Legion. That's what you can call us, Jesus, because we are many and we are powerful. Well, look here in verse 10. Here's that word beg, and that's another key word in this text. You see it in verse 7, "I adjure thee," or "I beg thee." And he says in verse 10, "And he besought him," or beg, it's the same word, beset him much, that he would not send them away out of the country, out of the region. Now there were nigh, and now Mark is telling you a little bit what is going on. Near to them, there was a herd of swine that was grazing along the mountains. Now we know that we are definitely in Gentile territory because there's pigs there, right? They didn't have pigs over on the western side. But over here on the eastern side, they had a bunch of pigs. A lot of people, and I don't want to get bogged down and get off track too much, but a lot of people think that this was probably a source for the Roman army, that they would have these pigs, and they would be the ones who would buy the pigs from these farmers. There were a bunch of pig farmers over there. There was a big herd of swine. There were 2,000 pigs that were grazing on the hillside there. It says in verse 11, a great herd of swine. Now watch this. It says there in verse 12, "And all the devils," there it is again, "besought him." They begged Jesus, "Send us into the swine that we may enter them." And forthwith Jesus gave them leave. In other words, he gave them permission. He said, "Yeah, sure, go into the swine." Watch this. "And the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place in the sea. There were about 2,000, and they were destroyed." Jesus destroys the demons. He destroys the pigs. Now, I know PETA is not going to like this, and they're going to get mad at this message, and they're going to be offended. But I'm telling you this, is that the point here is not about these pigs and running down a hillside. It's a great image, isn't it? I mean, you can see it in your mind, all these pigs running off a cliff and going into the water, and they're all dead, but the demons are destroyed. I want you to know this, is that we have to get our perspective correct on something, is that people are the most valuable thing to Jesus. Jesus saves a man. He has rescued the man from his pitiful condition. He has cast out these demons, and now this man, who is a threat to others and a threat to himself, is totally transformed by the power of God. So let's not worry about the pigs too much, but let's worry about people. People are important to Jesus. Now look at this in verse 14 through 20. The second thing I want you to see is the need for peace. You say, I already know that. I know that I need peace. I know that I need peace in my life. But here is the point of this, or what I want you to see is very important, is what kind of peace. Because you're going to see two responses in verses 14 through 20 to Jesus and what he has done. Watch, you see, first of all, you'll see the response of the people in the region, the people in the town. Look at verses 14 through 17. It says, "And they that fed the swine fled." In other words, the farmers who were tending to their herd of pigs, they ran off. They saw what happened. They told it to the people, and they went out to see what it was that was done. And look at this in verse 15. They come to Jesus and see him. They saw the man who was possessed by a devil, who had this devil, and look at this, and had the legion, and he was sitting and clothed, and he was in his right mind. The people who were the farmers who were out there, they saw and they witnessed everything that happened, and then they look and they see this man who was bound with chains, was a threat to others and threat to himself, and now they see that he is totally transformed. He is different. This is not the same person. This guy is in his right mind. He's not screaming and yelling and hurting people anymore. He is normal. Jesus has made him right. Jesus has made him have peace in his life. Now listen to me very carefully, because I want you to understand that peace is not just the absence of war. And peace is not comfortability. I know we all want to be comfortable, but you can be comfortable and you can also be lost and without Jesus. You can have things in your life that are going well. You can be wealthy. You can be accomplished. You can be successful and not have Jesus in your life. But dear friend, you do not have peace with God. This man has peace. The people who witnessed this miracle do not have peace. Now watch this. He says in verse 16, "And they that saw it told them how it befell to him that was possessed with the devil, and also concerning the swine. And they began to pray him," there is that word again, beg him to depart out of their coast. Which means that they were begging Jesus to leave. Jesus, you need to leave, because what we've seen here today doesn't make us comfortable. You have totally disrupted our life. You have destroyed 2,000 pigs, and now we see that this one who we had in a good spot, we had him right where we wanted him, we had him living in the tombs, he was away from us, and we were safe, and now you have come into our lives and totally made us uncomfortable. I want you to know something very, very important today, is that when Jesus comes into your life, he's going to disrupt your life. And you may not like it, but I'm going to tell you, it is better for you to be with Jesus and Jesus to bring peace, to bring you to have peace with God, rather than you be comfortable in your life. They reject Jesus. There is no other way to say it except they just flat out reject Jesus, and they tell him, "We want you out of here. You are disrupting our life. You are making us uncomfortable." So comfortability is not the same thing as peace, is it? Now look at the other reaction to this in verses 18 through 20, and it's the reaction of the man, the one who had been demon-possessed. And I want you to listen very carefully. Look at verse 18. "And when he was come into the ship," when Jesus, he's walking away, he's departing, he's going back to the boat, and he gets on the ship, he gets on the boat. "He that had been possessed with the devil," the one who he had cast out the devil from, comes up to him, and again there begs him. You see that? Prayed him, begs him that he might be with him. You have let me go back and I want to rehearse this one more time. Just a shot through here is that there's all kinds of begging going on in this text. Have you seen it? The devils are begging that they not be cast out, they not be destroyed. Well, they are. And then you have the begging of the people for Jesus to leave. "Jesus, please leave. We're begging you to leave." And now you have this man who is made new. He's transformed by the power of God. He is begging to be with Jesus. "I want to be with Jesus. I have been transformed and now I have peace with God." Let me stop right here. Do you think that this man knows anything about life and living a life of peace with God yet? Not really. But he knows this, that at one time he was under the control of many, many devils, and Jesus has freed him from that, and Jesus has done something and transformed his life. Jesus has changed his life forever, and so he begs to be with Jesus. I want to be with you, Jesus. Well, look at this. Jesus didn't allow it, but he says, because we might get a little disappointed right there, right? Well, why didn't Jesus let him come? Why didn't Jesus let him go with him and be a part of his ministry? I mean, the guy is begging you, Jesus. Sometimes, and this is something you want to take note of, sometimes the things that we want to do to serve Jesus is not exactly what Jesus wants us to do to serve him. Jesus says this in verse 19, "Man, I have a better idea for you. This is what I want you to do." He says, I want you to go, and I want you to talk to your family, and I want you to tell your family about everything that the Lord has done for you. I told you a while ago that people are more important to Jesus than anything. Do you remember that scripture, that time when Jesus said, unless a man leaves father and mother and forsakes everything and follows me, he will not inherit the kingdom of God? Remember that? When Jesus says you're going to have to say goodbye to everything, and the most important thing is following me. And here we have another example of Jesus is telling the man, you need to go and you need to help. You need to listen to me and you need to help the people that's closest to you. You need to tell them everything that the Lord has done for you. Look at verse 19. Go home to thy friends and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you and hath compassion on you. And he departed and he began to publish in Decapolis how great things Jesus had done for him, and all men did marvel. I want to close in just a couple of minutes here. This is very interesting. This Decapolis, the prefix Deca means 10, and polis means town or city. Decapolis means it's not one place, it's actually a collection of 10 cities. 9 of the cities were on the east side, and 1 was on the west side, but they were primarily Gentile cities. And what Jesus is saying is this, is that I want you to start proclaiming what Jesus has done for you to all these 10 cities. And so here we already have, early in the ministry of Jesus, we have a Gentile who has been transformed by the power of God, telling other Gentiles about Jesus and that he's come and that he's doing great things in this world. And so we already have our first missionary, don't we? We have this man who is living in these tombs, and now he's telling other people about Jesus. There was a man who was going to catch a train. He had an early train he had to catch, 8:05. He was hurrying. He was trying to get out of the house. And it had rained the night before. The ground was muddy. And he comes out the front door, and he didn't notice that his son was playing in the mud. And he kind of jumped over his son, but he fell down in the mud. His son was covered in mud, and now the father was also covered in mud too. He's trying to wear nice clothes. He's got a suit on, and he's late, and he's trying to hurry, but he's sitting in the mud. He looks over at his son, and he sees that they're both sitting in the mud, playing in the mud. Well, he thinks to himself, I really don't have time to go in and change. I've got to go. So he gets up, and he grabs his bag, and he gets up, and he thinks, you know what, I can clean up later. I got to catch this train. I'm going to miss the train. And so he takes off, and he gets on the train. There's something there about that story, though, that I want you to recognize. The first thing is this. The little boy, he intended to be in the mud, and he enjoyed playing in the mud. He liked the mud. All kids like playing in the mud, making mud pies, all this. The father of the son didn't intend to be playing in the mud, though, did he? He looked at his condition, and he looked around, and he said, I got to go. I didn't ever have a reason. I didn't want to be in the mud. I just got muddy. I want you to know this. There's two kinds of people in this world. Some are playing in the mud because they want to play in the mud. And there's other people that have gotten dirty in life and they've got mud on them, but they know that there's a greater purpose. Which one fits you? Are you playing in the mud because you like to be in the mud? Are you like the people there of Gadara, the Gerasenes, who enjoy playing in the mud, who want to live in the mud and be apart from Jesus, and they want to stay dirty? Or are you like others who have got a little mud on them from life, but that's not, you know that there's a greater purpose? Dear friend, you're going to get mud on you in this life. When you go to help people, when you live this life, you're going to stumble, you're going to fall, you're going to get some mud on you. But recognize this, is that there is a greater purpose, and you can move on, and you can serve Jesus. There's two options. There's a decision to make. Where are you with Jesus? I want to invite you to stand this morning. I want our musicians to come at this time. And I want you to think about, what have you done with Jesus? How have you responded to Him? I want you to know that Jesus can bring peace to your life. He can transform your life. True peace. I didn't say comfortability, but I said peace with God as we sing and as we have a song of invitation.